testimony here. And with that, I turn it to Ms. Romanato, who has 5 minutes remaining in this round.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And through you, I'd like to ask the witnesses a couple of other questions. We're not talking about privilege here when we're talking about closing the loophole with respect to MP harassment. I think, when I talk about privilege, let me rephrase that. What I'm talking about is not having healthy debate in the chamber. I think we should absolutely have healthy debate in the chamber. I think we should absolutely be questioning policies. We should absolutely be providing feedback to improve legislation. But when it comes to sometimes the civility in the House, when it comes to personal attacks, when that kind of behavior then spills out into social media, so that a member now is refraining from either going to the chamber or participating in debate or self-regulating what they say out of fear of all of that happening. Now we're into privilege. Can you comment on that? The fact that if we have members not going into the chamber or not participating in debate out of fear of what's going to come out on social media or their emails or the phone calls to their constituency, we are now prohibiting MPs from participating, and that is a point of privilege. Mr. Jans, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
It's a very good question that you raised, Ms. Romanato. Again, issues of decorum and what flows from that in the chamber, there are, as Jeffrey alluded to a bit earlier in response to a similar question, there are procedures and practices in place to address that. I'm not sure that changing the code would necessarily have a direct impact on that. And again, most jurisdictions carve that out as something to be treated separately. But obviously, no, you would not want to see members refraining deliberately themselves from attending sittings in the House because of fear of what could transpire or happen, either in the House or thereafter, because ultimately that's why they've been elected, is to represent constituents in the chamber. I don't know, Jeffrey, if you wanted to add.
I think we would all share the objective that members should be able to come and speak freely and without fear of consequences, and I think that's the entire concept of parliamentary privilege is meant to protect. The question you raised, though, is a tricky one about when members are then subjected to harassment or targeted for harassment for things that they have said after the fact, and how does one best handle that? And I think, if I understood you correctly, it's not necessarily what they get from other members, it's what they get from the general public, and the types of attacks that are now very easy to make behind one's keyboard in one's basement, and to do so very often anonymously without any consequences. And it's an interesting challenge to how to reduce that risk, and I think the platforms themselves have some responsibility in trying to police that, and I'm not sure if I understood Pat correctly that that's a responsibility they're taking very seriously today.
So I know all of my colleagues here today have gone through this. So in our parliamentary work, whether we're in committee right now, and I'm sure I've probably already got some emails in my inbox based on the questions I'm asking you today. Snowflake, can't take the heat. Oh, maybe, women, can't take it, don't run for office. What would you say to people who are considering this profession, who see what some people post on social media, who see some of the harassment that MPs go through, whether it be at an event, whether it be, in the grocery store? I can't buy ice cream at my grocery store because normally people stop me and they're asking me questions, and by the time I get to the cash, it's melted. And that's actually a good thing. But that being said, when people are thinking about this job, we have a responsibility on the civility in the House as well, whether we have a decorum or not. I think we do have a responsibility as colleagues. Nowhere in any other workplace would some of the behavior that we see be acceptable. Any other workplace in Canada, the person would be terminated. What can you say to people who are considering this profession, given everything that you see that we go through?
About 20 seconds.
It's a very good point. I mean, I think we all find it tremendously unfortunate what members and prospective members are subjected to. I would hope that would not overly discourage people who have an interest in public service from nonetheless putting their name forward and seeking election and making a contribution to Canada and Canada's Parliament. But you're absolutely right. It is a concern for many, and certainly our team, to the best that we can, is there to support and to help.
Thank you, Mr. Chance. The floor is to a Conservative member, but I don't have a member. Ms. Rempel-Garner? Okay, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. McDonald, in your conversations with law enforcement, has there ever been any discussion about the need for clarity in law around what constitutes online criminal harassment, or perhaps additional tools that law enforcement could use, or that there's a gap in right now to de-escalate behavior or to prevent it from escalating?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I don't recall, Madame, having a discussion of that nature with law enforcement partners.
The reason why I ask is because we're having a conversation now on online, essentially the broader issue of online harassment. And I know that the RCMP there was an article, I believe it was in the CBC last week, saying that the RCMP is recommending additional tools for members of Parliament to prevent from harassment. But my reaction to that was, well, if they can't protect me, then how are they protecting everyone else? So I'm just wondering, based on your experience, if you would have any suggestions that the committee could recommend to perhaps close some of those gaps. Like, for example, the fact that it's very difficult at present, or it's gray to understand, like, when and how law enforcement can find the identity of somebody who is repeatedly, and not like one-off, but like repeatedly harassing somebody online in a threatening way that could become criminal, be deemed as criminal harassment.
Yes, I think there's lots to be done, can be done, and should be done in relation to the harassment of members of Parliament, politicians in general, and the general public. When we first started up our open source intelligence unit, we focused on the harassment of members of Parliament, and we had great contacts and on the social media platforms, and would ask them to take down posts that were against their own regulations. Well, in the last few years, that's fallen by the wayside. Sometimes they answer the phone, sometimes they don't, often they don't. I was speaking earlier before we came back about Twitter used to be our best contact for bringing stuff down off of social media. And once the new owner took over, the people, our contacts there, were let go. And now there's nobody to contact at that particular social media platform to bring down information.
At that time, when you talk about bringing down information, did the House have a clearly defined set of guidelines on when they would ask for something to, quote, be brought down? I'm just concerned about...
Yeah, sorry.
It sounds like impingement on speech, potentially.
Well, it was just their regulation, the terms and conditions of the social media platform, if they were breached. And we would only contact the social media platform with the authorization of the MP. We would not go out on our own. But anyone can contact the social media platform.
It seems to me, based on this conversation, that there's a gap between understanding, or there's a gap between what is clear in law in terms of what constitutes online criminal harassment and what tools could be used to either prevent the escalation of that happening when there's a clear pattern of behavior. And I'm not talking about like a single mean tweet or something. I mean like a clear escalation in harassment. And what is actually being used in practice right now. It seems like a bit of a hodgepodge. Would that be a correct assessment? And I'm not saying like ascribing motive, or it seems like there's a lack of clarity in law in this regard.
I would agree.
Thank you. I'll close with this question. Since this committee was last seized with this issue. I think that there was a purposeful decision taken to not include MP harassment in the changes to the labor code. Has your shop, Mr. Jantz, given any thought to how non-sexual harassment would be defined? I know that this has already been discussed somewhat today, but has there any thought been given to that by your team?
About 30 seconds, please.
Not considerable, but I think you, Carolyn, might have a standard definition that's often used.
In 30 seconds, I would say there is already in the harassment prevention policy a definition right now that we could definitely be reviewing. But there's always the Canadian Human Rights Act, right, that we can actually look back on and make sure that we're taking the best of the definition and putting it forward.
Thanks very much. Ms. Shanahan, over to you for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. And actually, I'd like to take up that last point because there does seem to be some confusion here among the members as to what constitutes harassment. And so I refer to the code that already exists for harassment and violence in the workplace, Appendix 1. And I find it very thorough, but it is clear there that harassment may include, but is not limited to, offensive or intimidating comments or jokes. There's another point about abuse of authority, which doesn't apply here because this has to do with employers and employees. But it goes on to say, spreading malicious rumors or gossip about an individual or group, cyberbullying, threatening, spreading rumors, or negatively talking to or about someone online or on social media, socially excluding or isolating someone, persistently criticizing, undermining, belittling, demeaning, or ridiculing a person. Psychological harassment. I'm picking out the ones that I think are most pertinent to our discussion here today. Sexist remarks, racist remarks, homophobic remarks, transphobic remarks, verbal threats or intimidation, and so on, making aggressive, threatening, or rude gestures. Harassment is not. And the first point has to do with management responsibilities. But the second point, very pertinent to our discussion today, harassment is not a disagreement regarding a policy or practice. So I would ask you, does this constitute a good basis to address this gap in the member-to-member code of conduct, if you will, regarding non-sexual harassment?
I would say yes, but there's definitely a study to be done in the context of the environment.
Excellent, because I think what we've heard today are examples, too, of how social media, which is a tool for all of us, is being weaponized, effectively weaponized by members. And in some cases, our social media accounts are actually paid for by the House of Commons, so it does come under the purview of our MOB. Or our staff operate our social media accounts, so they're salaried staff there, and we can talk about. I appreciated the points that Ms. Matheson made. We can talk about the effects of staff both in dealing with social media and also producing harassment media. So is what I'm hearing that this gap really has to do with, it's one thing what is governed within the House of Commons by the Speaker or in committee by chairs, but once it leaves this House by the vehicle of social media, and this is what is brand new, is this not an area where it behooves us to put a policy into place? I'm thinking, Monsieur Bedard, too, historically, in the House of Commons, we have two sword lengths, do we not, between the opposing side? Because there was a time that physical violence, and God forbid, I hope we never get to that point again, but the two sword lengths, I think we need to talk about putting preventive barriers around the use of social media. Monsieur Bedard, would there be something legislatively that would cover that otherwise?
1 minute remaining here.
With respect to the two swords, we haven't taken any measurement recently. You alluded to some definition of harassment and examples. The definitions you alluded is actually in the labor code, and these were examples. Now, whether to the code of conduct, sexual harassment, or general harassment, if members want to start from the existing definition of harassment, which is applicable in the federal workplace, and adjust it to the savor of Parliament, because there is a unique component to Parliament as a workplace, the House of Commons. We mentioned parliamentary proceedings. Also, we need to be mindful of the fact that there are about half of the chamber that is called the opposition. You don't have that in any regular workplace. So, and the main role of the opposition is to oppose, to make sure that the government is accountable. You don't have that in a normal workplace as well. So any measures that are to be put in place, if any, have to take into consideration the unique nature of the role of government, opposition in our system of government.
Okay, unfortunately, Ms. Shannon, that's all of our time. Madame Gaudreau, c'est à vous encore pour...
You have 2 minutes, 30 seconds, Madame Gaudreau. Well, I'm going to move along then. Chair, I just wanted to say that at the National Assembly of Quebec in 2015, did not distinguish between members and employees or anyone else. And it works out very well. We can look at the figures to see what, to ascertain that. I would say, listening to everyone, that prevention is essential. But when you talk about a code of conduct, and when you are dealing with an elected representative of who is 25 or another who's 75 years of age, do the exercise. Just reflect. What possibility, what is the potential for harassment for these two individuals? So really, I think that the younger members have to respect the generational difference and also understand what could be done 40 years ago is no longer acceptable in today's context. When I'm dealing with my daughters, even for me, something might be okay, but for her, it's non-negotiable. So we have chosen to be here. We have a role to play. And in respecting a code of conduct, I think that we should be able to fulfill those roles. I'm a member of this committee. I'm a sociologist as well and an entrepreneur, and I'm particularly happy to be able to cooperate and work with you. Thank you. If I have 30, you can have 30 seconds if you have it. So let's have an answer. What do you think? Well, we are there to support you and to help you make recommendations in your committee here, PROC. So you are there to discuss how to move forward, but we are there to support you. Thank you.
For 2.5 minutes.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. I have two big questions, unfortunately, within 2.5 minutes. So there's a concern of mine that as we try to move forward, and maybe this would be for the subcommittee to talk about, but to get the opinions of members of Parliament on how we start to deal with these issues. Obviously, we want that to be protected. Do you have any advice for this committee on how that could happen in terms of ensuring that even former members, members who are not reoffering, current members can be protected in terms of anonymity. If we start to survey them, is there a mechanism in place that could do that on this issue? The other question that I'll squeeze in there is, I wanted to ask about witnesses. We are seeing witnesses not come forward as much at committee. We are also seeing this clipping culture, these gotcha politic moments that are now turning on members of academia or those incredible stakeholders that we rely so much upon. What can we do to better protect them? They are protected under privilege, and yet when they leave here, their testimony is used against them to a point where they may not return, and that's really quite critical. So I'd like your opinions on that.
Maybe I'll start and others can jump in. In terms of a process of consulting either current members or past members, certainly that's one of the tools that's available to any committee in terms of how extensive consultations want to be undertaken. There might be a need for caucus consultations, see what each caucus has in terms of views. Your point about witnesses is a good one. Obviously, witnesses are a key component to committee proceedings and the testimony that they provide, and any actions that result in a chilling effect and discourage them from volunteering to come before a committee to provide their advice and their expertise is certainly a preoccupation.
Do those witnesses have any redress if things happen to them in that regard? There's no access to parliamentary privilege or parliamentary resources like we have in the same instance?
We have in recent years, very quickly, we have very recently years started to make available to witness some supports, especially witnesses who come forward. I don't know it's necessarily the situation you're describing, but witnesses who come forward in the context of very difficult studies, very emotional studies, where there's something very traumatic that they come to share, where we've been making available to them the same sorts of supports that would be available to members or other members of the House Administration, but it's a relatively limited thing at present. In terms of retribution, any sort of retribution against a witness for testimony they give could be punished as a breach of privilege. The expectation is that witnesses come here to share information so that Parliament can do its job, and anybody who seeks to silence them or to punish them for that is doing a disservice to Parliament and to the democratic exercise. But how does that actually occur? What does one do in order to ensure that they're protected is challenging, especially like what we're used to seeing is the sort of idea of reprisals from their employer, or like if you're a whistleblower and then you're sanctioned for coming forward, but then to be then subject to attacks in the public sphere online. I think it's a different order, and it's maybe not something we're as familiar with or as well equipped to deal with at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Leblanc. I will ask, we're heading into the final 2 lines of questioning, which will be about 10 minutes, but I will submit now that it would be useful, I think, to the committee for our witnesses to provide written answers to anything that members may have felt we didn't get the time to address substantively. So we would ask witnesses for your cooperation in that matter. We will go to Mr. Calkins for 5 minutes, followed by Ms. Dama for 5 minutes, and that will conclude our 2-hour panel this morning. Mr. Calkins, 5 minutes to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I mean, these fine folks here do work for Parliament, so I'm sure they would make themselves available to come back if it was deemed necessary. I want to just a lot of has been said about missing or gaps, missing rules or regulations or so on, but I just want to get a clear state of where we actually are. So notwithstanding the labor code issues and everything that's been brought up, we already do have criminal sanctions for harassment. We have criminal sanctions for hate speech in the criminal code. We also have civil law dealing with libel and or slander, which I'm not sure has been fully tested when it comes to parliamentary privilege. So in the context of those provisions being there, we also have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is premised largely upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which gives us freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And at what point do we encroach on parliamentary privilege, on freedom of rights, and including freedom of expression? And why aren't the other mechanisms that I talked about, the criminal sanctions and the civil sanctions, enough to govern this space?
It's a very good question, and I think would be probably a focus of a large part of the discussion of either this committee or a subcommittee as to definitions and boundaries. You're right, there's a lot that exists right now, but what I think we're sensing from some of the comments that have been made to date is that that is perhaps not sufficient, and there's maybe something in between that should be codified.
Perhaps. I'm not saying that. Is it an enforcement issue? Is it a resource issue? Is it an actual lack of rules or laws issue? I guess that's the nature of my question.
Thank you for the question. The various instruments you refer to, the criminal code, libel, slander, they have specific threshold, and those thresholds that are applicable will not be the same that will apply to harassment. The threshold for harassment in the workplace will be different. So you first will meet the threshold for harassment, then civil liability, and then criminal liability. One thing that I will add too, because you mentioned parliamentary privilege and that it hasn't been tested, even the criminal code makes explicit provision that hate speech provision do not apply to words that are spoken in the chamber. Same thing for legal action that will be, civil legal action that will be taken against a member or witness for what they've said during the proceedings will be excluded, will be dismissed.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Michelle. I really do. But if something is spoken in the chamber, something is spoken in a committee, and it is republished on a social media platform, has that been clarified insofar as the tests of privilege and libel and or slander?
This will depend on the circumstances, and you're correct that there's no major ruling addressing the issue. If it's a exhaustive reproduction of parliamentary proceedings, there will be a common law protection that will apply, and it will be an absolute protection. If it's only an abstract of the proceedings that are republished, that will depend on the circumstances and the intention of the person who did the publication.
And would anybody like to weigh in on the public interest that's also at stake in this conversation about being able to disseminate information that happens during our parliamentary proceedings, and whether or not we should be including the public interest in this conversation?
I alluded earlier to the absolute common law protection for the publishing of the entire proceedings of the House, which is based on the public interest, the fact that people have a public interest to know what is taking place in Parliament, in committee. Same thing for when it's an abstract or partial reproduction. There is an exception that is made in the law that if the person did that reproduction in good faith, there will be a protection afforded. So I will say that yes, there is a general interest for the public to see what its representatives are doing to vote laws to make sure that the government is accountable.
Okay.
Okay, that's about it. Thank you very much, Mr. Calkins. Ms. Damoff, to you for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk about physical safety in constituency offices. Recently, we got a notice from the Sergeant-at-Arms to keep our offices closed. My office is closed all the time now, except by appointment, on recommendation from Parliamentary Protective Services, and there's a sign on the door to that effect. But in particular, we got a notice a few weeks ago about climate Axe the Tax demonstrations. And that was something the Leader of the Opposition had called for the public to go to MPs' offices to demonstrate. And then shortly afterwards, we get a notice that we're to make sure that we're vigilant, to keep the doors locked. How dangerous is that type of call by politicians to act, and then it results in us as MPs being less accessible and also putting our staff in danger in community offices?
Yeah, so I was the one, as a Sergeant-at-Arms, that sent that memo out on that particular day to keep the offices locked. It wasn't related to what a political party here published. We picked it up off our the intent to visit MP offices. We picked that up from a group who had posted on the internet that it was their intent to visit members of Parliament offices and protest. So that's why that was published. And also we picked up off the open source monitoring the possibility of demonstrating at residences of members of Parliament, and indeed over the past month there have been demonstrations at certain members of Parliament residences.
Ms. Matheson talked about the difficulty in getting witnesses, and I've experienced that as well. When we were studying Bill C-21, we also had death threats being given to officials, so members of the civil service, nonpartisan members of the public service who appeared, and the chair of the committee had to warn the Conservative members to tone down the type of the way they were questioning these officials, because it was directly impacting their safety. When Ms. Shanahan read the definition of harassment, it included, cyberbullying, spreading of malicious rumors. Should that not apply to MPs and our behavior as well?
It's a very good question, and again, I think something that the committee and a potential subcommittee would want to think long and hard about. It's that line, I guess, between the genuine need to be as free as possible to express views and play the role of either a government member or an opposition member, versus, to your point, the right to have a healthy work environment for members, their staff, anybody else who sets foot on Parliament Hill. It's a very difficult question.
If you don't, I wanted to talk a little bit more about staff, because it's becoming more difficult as an MP to not only hire staff but retain staff because of the abuse that they're receiving in offices. The phone calls, for example, mostly in the community office, but they also read about what's going on and they see social media. And it's becoming difficult to retain people, understandably, despite services that you offer. It's first of all, they're not. They just shouldn't be subjected to this in any way, shape, or form. Do you want to comment maybe on the retention and hiring difficulties that MPs are facing?
Got about 30 seconds here.
There's a talent war out there, so I would say it's not limited to MPs, but definitely the environment would definitely contribute more if they are seeing it both on social media or in committees or. But I would say at this point I would always encourage to come back and maybe reach out to us just to make sure that there are some preventative measures that are put in place for employees to just ensure that they're feeling safe both mentally and physically. I would just urge to contact us.
Merci. Okay, colleagues, that concludes the first panel for today's portion of our study. I would like to thank Mr. Leblanc, Mr. McDonnell, Mr. Bédard, Mr. Jantz, Ms. Evangelidis for being here with us. Colleagues, that was a productive, efficient, and most importantly, respectful first half of our conversation today. It was very informative and I think serves as a beautiful catalyst for what's to come. So thank you very much for being here. We're going to suspend for 5 minutes to set up our next panel, and we will resume shortly.
I'll call the meeting back to order for our second panel.
Today we have with us the Honourable Greg Fergus, Speaker of the House of Commons. Welcome to PROC, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues, as you know, we are here today continuing our conversation on harassment, as we had just undertaken in the past couple of hours. As per the last round of questioning, we will have first round that comprises of 6 minutes to members of each party, and then we will move on to a second round, which will be slightly reduced in time. Colleagues, just a reminder in terms of the protocols around our audio devices, out of respect to our translators, their health and safety, and the hard work that they undertake on our behalf, please make sure that we are placing, when not in use, our earpieces on the stickers. I note that Monsieur Leblanc, Monsieur Bédard, Mr. Jantz, and Ms. Evangelidis are still with us, so welcome back. With that, colleagues, we are going to get right into things. Mr. Speaker, there are 10 minutes available to you for opening remarks. With that, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I thank the committee for inviting me to appear today to discuss this important issue of harassment at the House of Commons. You have already heard from House officials on this complex matter, and I understand that they spoke to you in detail about the policies in place in the House of Commons to address issues of workplace harassment relating to employees, as well as harassment issues between members of Parliament. As committee members know, it has been my objective to improve the atmosphere in the House. Decorum is an issue which has been raised with me not only by members, but also by the general public. How members treat each other in our workplace is, of course, of interest to all of us. La Chambre des Communes est une des...
The House of Commons is one of the oldest institutions in our country. Its form of proceedings is even older. However, it must also find ways to balance these deeply rooted traditions with the expectations of modern workplaces. On an individual level, these measures exist to foster work environments where people feel safe and unthreatened. As Speaker, I play an important role in the management of the House of Commons as Chair of the Board of Internal Economy, which is responsible for the administrative and financial affairs of the House. My responsibilities also cover the presiding of parliamentary proceedings. My comments will focus primarily on the latter area.
Harassment measures detailed by officials earlier cover employees who work on Parliament Hill. That includes staff of the House of Commons and staff working for members of Parliament. Employers of these categories of staff are subject in various ways to the provisions of these measures. However, other than the code of conduct dealing with sexual harassment between members, there are currently no workplace measures in place to address other forms of harassment that might occur between members of Parliament within the context of proceedings in the House and committees. The House is not unique in this regard, as many other assemblies do not apply internal codes of conduct to their proceedings. While there could be instances of harassment that are physical or sexual in connection to the proceedings in Parliament, generally, the likeliest form of harassment in this context would be through the spoken word, when members are participating in debate in the chamber or in a committee meeting. Comme nous le savons,
as we know, a preeminent immunity enjoyed by members while discharging their parliamentary duties in the House and committees is that of freedom of speech. On April 29, 1977, the Special Committee on Rights and Immunities of Members presented its first report, which can be found at pages 720 to 729 of that day, of the journals of that day. It states that for members, freedom of speech, and I quote, is a fundamental right without which they would be hampered in the performance of their duties. It permits them to speak in the House without inhibition, to refer to any matter or express any opinion as they see fit, to say what they feel needs to be said in furtherance of the national interest and the aspirations of their constituents. End of quote.
The ability to engage in debate in a robust and frequently pointed fashion. This age-old feature of our House, this is an age-old feature of our House and is the cornerstone of our Westminster-style parliamentary tradition. It ensures that a member has full latitude in pursuing any matter of public interest or of importance to them. As such, this is an immunity that is fundamental to our proceedings. I must emphasize, however, that this does not mean that members have no protections in the chamber or committees from inappropriate comments from other members. Another ancient principle of our tradition are the rights that the House enjoys as a collectivity, which are catalogued in the House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, at pages 119 to 141. Chief among them is, and I quote, the regulation of its own affairs, unquote. This refers to the House's exclusive authority to control, quote, its own debates, agenda, and proceedings as they relate to its legislative and deliberative functions, unquote. Related to this is the House's exclusive right to discipline its members. Through these powers, the House has tools to hold any member accountable for any action that may be viewed as conduct unbecoming and misbehavior, including in the exercise of their individual right to freedom of speech. The House has exercised these powers in the past to address cases of inappropriate behavior by a member. Les préoccupations que suscitent depuis quelque temps les propos non
The ongoing concern over inappropriate parliamentary language in the House, especially that of a personal nature designed to attack, to belittle, or bully, is ultimately a matter of decorum. Part of how decorum is improved in our proceedings is by removing the aspects of our debate that aim to personalize political criticism. As we've seen in the past, making things personal frequently elicits strong counter-reactions, reactions that are not only disorderly to our proceedings, but can genuinely be felt to be harassing when an individual on the receiving end of the personal comments of the critic.
Members' goodwill can be appealed to voluntarily improve the atmosphere in the House. However, stronger measures may be needed on rare occasions. In this respect, if the power to enforce proper decorum rests in my hands, broader disciplinary tools are properly the purview of the House. I would suggest that the House be prepared to use its power to discipline in those rare cases where statements may cross the line, bordering or reaching the threshold of serious misconduct. While the House has effective disciplinary tools and a strong commitment from the chair to make improvements to decorum, it cannot be done without the cooperation of all members. The second point I'd like to address is whether stronger rules are needed to address instances of harassment amongst members. As the committee knows, the standing orders of the House of Commons contains 2 appendices. The first, the Conflict of Interest Code for members of the House of Commons, which deals with obligations of members to avoid conflicts of interest of a pecuniary nature when carrying out their parliamentary functions. The second, the Code of Conduct for members of the House of Commons, sexual harassment between members, defines sexual harassment and sets out a dispute resolution mechanism when complaints arise.
However, missing from both these policies are rules that could address the issue of other forms of harassment between members. Some have seen its absence as a gap. I would only caution that any attempt to expand these codes of conduct should be done in a way that respects the privileges that are enjoyed by the House and its members. Before concluding, I would like to address one other issue, namely social media. Members are very aware of, and unfortunately often the target of, vile and sometimes criminal comments made towards them on various platforms. These comments are most often made via cowardly anonymous accounts, making follow-up action by either cyber security or by the police very difficult.
Never to the same degree. There have been instances of members posting comments regarding fellow members on social media that some would qualify as inappropriate or even harassment. While obviously a serious matter, it is not one that the Speaker has jurisdiction over. It is a long-standing practice that the Speaker does not comment on statements made outside of the chamber. I'm grateful to the committee for their attention to this matter. It is important work and it is timely. Those are my thoughts on the issue. I hope my testimony will help the committee in its work in considering this matter. I very much look forward to the recommendations that this committee might be able to offer the House. I remain at your disposal to further assist the committee as it moves forward on this study. Je vous remercie.
I thank all members for their attention, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have. Thank you very much, Speaker.
Ms. Rempel-Garner, it is your floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Speaker. Speaker, you're responsible for overseeing the harassment policy for the House of Commons. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Would you characterize a physical altercation between members in the chamber as a potential instance of harassment?
Well, to be clear, that would be more of I should just modify the first. I'm responsible for the sexual harassment between members, as it was listed. If there was a physical altercation, yes, that would be behavior that would be considered unbecoming.
Thank you. On May 18th, 2016, the Prime Minister grabbed late Conservative MP Gord Brown by the arm and then elbowed former NDP MP Ruth Ellen Brosseau in the chest. Ms. Brosseau expressed that she had been injured, and in that moment, you're recorded on the Hansard as saying, you described Ms. Brosseau's complaint as reminiscent of a dive in the 2006 World Cup, and that she was exaggerating. On what basis did you arrive at the finding that Ms. Brosseau was either diving or exaggerating what had happened in the House?
If I recall, my statement on that wasn't in regard to Madame Brosseau's accounting of the incident, but of other folks' accounting of the incident, which was...
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So are you saying she experienced it differently than what she had said in the House?
No, I think she experienced it exactly the way she expressed it in the House.
Yet you said it was... I'm just curious at how you arrived that it was a dive.
I was commenting on how other people were characterizing, not what Madame Brosseau had said, about what other people had described it as being.
Well, your exact statement was it happened exactly as the Prime Minister had described it. So I guess that's your statement, and you're now responsible for overseeing the harassment policy. Given that this instance and the numerous instances of partisanship you've been accused of while you've been sitting in your term as chair, do you think that opposition MPs would feel safe or empowered to report instances of any sort of harassment, given that this department comes under your supervision?
They could have complete confidence that issues of harassment, if it's raised, will be given the full and treatment under my office.
See,
and by
I
me
don't
personally.
think so, Speaker. Oftentimes women don't report harassment because men in spaces of power where they have demonstrable past experiences of holding on to that power and protecting those in their circle, that's where justice isn't served. And so my concern with your partisanship is mostly to do with this issue. We are discussing a very serious issue here. This is something that impacts all MPs. And I am not sure that if I reported something to you, that you would treat me fairly, that I wouldn't have my issue twisted for partisan gain because of the repeated instances of partisanship. And that's why I have lost faith in your speakership. So given all of this, do you think that the fact that I have to ask this question or make these statements will prevent MPs or staff members coming forward from reporting instances of harassment because of your track record in this issue?
I don't believe so. I believe that members should feel fully confident in my ability to ensure that they are given every and to the fullest extent of the rules that have been set forward by the House of Commons to bring, when they bring forward serious issues, such as harassment, especially sexual harassment, that it would be treated with the utmost seriousness and to the fullest extent possible.
Yet in the moment when you had an opportunity as a peer in the House of Commons to give a woman space and hear her argument out, your exact words were this: what happened was exactly as the Prime Minister had described it. If I came in and I said, this happened with a Liberal member or a Conservative member, whose side would you take?
I would clearly want to make sure that the process was entirely fair and that your story and that your concerns would be raised and pursued to the fullest possible extent.
How can I have that assurance?
That could happen.
How can I have that assurance
I'm
when you've
offering you
had
that
three clear instances of like being partisan while in the chair? Forget the fact that you were the Prime Minister's parliamentary secretary. Like, I'm saying this out of deep severity. That is, I believe you've lost my confidence because of this issue. You are in charge of the harassment policy, something that is very serious because it governs the workplace safety of everybody here. I just want to end with this. I don't understand why the NDP, given that this happened with one of their colleagues, is still propping you up. I don't get that. But again, I just want to give you, how could you in that moment, in showing a judge of fairness, supposed fairness, how could you arrive that this woman experienced it differently and that the Prime Minister, what basis did you use to make that comment in 2016?
Well, I can tell you that I never questioned Ruth Ann Brousseau's accounting of the situation.
You did. You said, I believe him, not I believe her. And that is what is wrong with every workplace around the world. And yet you demonstrated that in that moment. And deeply disappointing.
We have about 10 seconds left. Mr. Speaker, did you want
quickly,
to
just very quickly, once again, never doubted her accounting, and my characterization of it at the time was due to how other
gaslight
members...
me on that right now?
Mr. Rumpelgartner, I think either we have to let the clock run or we have to afford the Speaker the opportunity to respond. Mr. Speaker, did you want to take the last few seconds, or do you feel satisfied with the response?
I would just like to say that, again, just to make sure that the record stands, that my description of that event was an accounting of what other people had described her event, and not how she had put it on.
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Romanato, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and through you, I'd like to thank the Speaker for being here today. So in the previous panel, we had some excellent testimony with respect to the harassment policy that currently does not apply between harassment between two members of Parliament. And we talked a little bit about the difference between having healthy debate in the chamber, bringing forward questions on policy, bringing forward recommendations to improve legislation, and sometimes a lack of civility in the House, and how that can be used outside of the House. So, as you know, in 1977, cameras were allowed into the chamber to allow Canadians to participate in debate and learn more about our democracy, which is incredibly important. But I also know that often when I'm in the chamber, it seems like it's theater. And I remember when I first got here, someone said that to me, question period is the theater. And it's for the clips that are used to then put on social media. You mentioned that anything that comments made outside of the chamber are not the purview of the Speaker. But if members of Parliament are taking clips from inside the chamber, putting them on their social media, that then generates sometimes unhealthy comments, what would you recommend? Is there anything that this committee could recommend to improve the civility in the House and understanding that the words that we use matter, that there are ramifications for sometimes the words that we use, and that some people out there are are using that as a way to intimidate members of parliament. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Through you, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question. It's really important, once again, to note that the Speaker, according to the rules and the long-time tradition of this place, does not have a purview over what happens outside of the House, outside of committees. If, however, members, and this is the reason why I'm presuming that the committee had been struck to take a look at this issue, are free to propose solutions and perhaps could direct members themselves in determining what would be considered behavior that's unbecoming, could direct the Speaker to observe for that, but it has been a tradition that the Speaker doesn't go there for many reasons. And whatever this committee comes up with would have to be tempered, of course, with the long-standing traditions of this House to allow for as much as possible full and free ability to speak to issues. That is fundamental to the roles which we play as members of Parliament, and one that should always be looked at and should be minimized with the greatest of care.
Thank you. So, in terms of decorum in the House, we do have certain standing orders that members need to abide by. We can't question the integrity of a member. All members are honorable and so on. But we've noticed that it's getting harder and harder in the chamber for members to respect that. And we're seeing, especially I guess we're in what we call silly season, where tempers get a little flared in the House and so on. Do you think that we should be making some recommendations in the standing orders to include, for instance, you mentioned that we have the code of conduct for sexual harassment in the appendix of the standing orders. We also have the conflict of interest code in our appendix of the standing orders. But we do not have harassment between members in the current standing orders. We have free from molestation as a standing order, free from questioning the integrity, but we do not have harassment. Should we be amending the standing orders to include harassment amongst members?
That's going to be up to members. And I'm assuming that this committee is going to be doing that and proposing a report to all members in the House. So it will be up to you to determine, do you want to go beyond the sexual harassment rules that we set out and to consider harassment generally. And to do so, of course, tempered by the importance of allowing members to have as full a possible range of free speech. It could be... I think decorum and civility are really important. I think it is possible for us to have pointed and passionate debates, but one which does so within the confines that is respectful of the traditions of this place. And in fact, what those traditions end up being are traditions that I think that any constitutional democracy would consider appropriate. And so I think it allows us to continue in that best manner. So I'm really interested into what the work that this committee will do and to the people and the witnesses who you speak to and the recommendations that you'll have.
So on that last point,
Very quickly, Ms. Brown.
Because this committee cannot, we can make recommendations, but I believe it's actually the Board of Internal Economy that would actually institute any recommendations, and I understand that the Speaker is on the Board of Internal Economy and chairs it. So given that we cannot, normally we table a committee report in the House and ask the government to respond, but because the government is not responsible for this, how would you suggest that we word any recommendations in our report to the House to make sure that we can get the adequate response?
Very simply, you would change you would make recommendations to the code of conduct of members, and then the board will, if adopted by the House, then or concurred by the House, then the board will act accordingly.
Thanks, Madam. Sorry? Yeah, very quickly, Mr.
Just
Jansen.
a quick clarification. Again, there's two things. There's the policy that falls under the jurisdiction of the board, and then there's the code, which falls under the jurisdiction of PROC and then recommended to the House. So again, if the idea is to change the code, that would fall within the jurisdiction of this committee, could report to the House, and if the House adopts it, then the annex to the standing orders would thereby be changed. If it's changes to the policy, the process would be for this committee to write a letter with suggestions, recommendations to the board.
Thanks very much, Mr. Jans. Madame Gaudreau, à vous pour 6 minutes.
6 minutes. This is something that's very important, what we've just spoken about. Thank you very much, Chair, and I thank the Speaker for being with us this morning as well. I think we know each other well. We've been on PROC together, and I've been on PROC for 5 years, and myself. Things have changed in terms of the free deliberations in the House, but I have to also say that I am fearful of the climate in the House. There's been a great deal of slippage. Every week, I have students visiting me, and I have to do a debriefing with them afterwards because I'm ashamed of what they've seen. And if I were to ask a secret question,